Donald thought it would help me with the book if I saw his Palm Beach mansion firsthand. The phone rang. It was Philip Johnson. As they chatted, Donald suddenly seemed to get an idea. He put the phone on speaker. "Philip," he said, "you have to talk to my niece. She's writing my next book. You can tell her all about the Taj." I introduced myself, and Philip suggested I come to his house in Connecticut the following week to discuss the book. After Donald finished the call, he said to me, "That'll be fantastic. Philip is a great guy. I hired him to design the porte cochere for the Taj Mahal. It's tremendous. I'd never seen anything like it." After we finished discussing the logistics of our trip to Florida, I left the office and headed to the library. I had no idea who Philip Johnson was, and I had never heard of a porte cochere. In the limo on the way to the airport the following day, I told Donald that I'd arranged to meet Johnson at his home, which I'd learned at the library was the very famous glass house that he, a very famous architect, had designed. I had also discovered that the thing Johnson had designed for the Taj, what Donald called a porte cochere, was a porte cochere, basically a large carport. I understood why Donald had wanted Johnson to be involved in the project. He wasn't just famous, he also traveled in the kind of circles Donald aspired to. I didn't, however, understand why Johnson would bother designing the Taj's carport. It was a very small-scale project that seemed not worth his while. When Donald picked up a copy of the New York Post less than 10 minutes into the car ride, I knew he had no intention of giving me information for the book. I'd begun to suspect that he'd hired me without consulting his publisher because he didn't want to be micromanaged by the people there. It would also be a lot easier to put off his niece, who wasn't under contract and was barely getting paid, than a professional writer who would most likely have a significant stake in the success of the book. But we were about to be trapped together on a plane for 2 hours, so I hoped he might talk to me then. When we got into the cabin of the jet that was waiting for us on the tarmac, Donald spread out his arms and asked, "So, what do you think?" "It's great, Donald." I knew the drill. As soon as we reached cruising altitude and we could unbuckle our seatbelts, one of his bodyguards handed him a huge stack of mail after setting a glass of Diet Coke next to him. I watched as he opened one envelope after another, then, after examining the contents for a few seconds, threw them and the envelope onto the floor. When a large pile accumulated, the same guy would reappear, pick up the waste paper, and throw it into the garbage. That happened over and over again. I moved to another seat, so I didn't have to watch. The staff were waiting as the car pulled up to the entrance at Mar-a-Lago. Donald went off with his butler, and I introduced myself to everybody else. The 58-bedroom mansion with 33 bathrooms outfitted with fixtures plated in gold and an 1,800-square-foot living room that sported 42-foot ceilings was as garish and uncomfortable as I'd expected. Dinner that evening was just me, Donald, and Marla. She and I had met a few times before, but we had never had a chance to get to know each other one-on-one. I found her friendly, and Donald seemed relaxed with her. She was just 2 years older than I was, and about as different from Ivana as a human being could be. Marla was down-to-earth and soft-spoken, where Ivana was all flash, arrogance, and spite. The next day, I spent the morning exploring the property. There were no other guests, so the entire place felt empty and strangely quiet. I talked to the butler to see if he had any interesting stories, got to know some of the other guys who worked there, and then took a quick swim before lunch, which was scheduled for 1 p.m. As formal as Mar-a-Lago was in some ways, it was also much more casual than our usual family gathering places, so I felt comfortable wearing a bathing suit and a pair of shorts to lunch, which was being served on the patio. Donald, who was wearing golf clothes, looked up at me as I approached, as if he'd never really seen me before. "Holy shit, Mary, you're stacked." "Donald," Marla said in mock horror, slapping him lightly on the arm. I was 29 and not easily embarrassed, but my face reddened and I suddenly felt self-conscious. I pulled my towel around my shoulders. It occurred to me that nobody in my family, outside of my parents and brother, had ever seen me in a bathing suit. Unfortunately for the book, that was about the only interesting thing that happened during my entire visit to Palm Beach. Back in New York, Donald finally got sick of my asking him to sit for an interview and handed me a list of names. Talk to these people. Included were the presidents of his casinos and Marianne's husband, John. Although that was potentially helpful, he didn't seem to understand that writing the book without any input from him would be close to impossible. I met with all the presidents of the casinos. Not surprisingly, a lot of their answers were canned, and I realized that they weren't going to give me dirt on what was happening in their boss's business at the height of the chaos and dysfunction. The trips weren't a total waste of time. I'd never been down there before, and at least I got a sense of the place. My meeting with John Barry was even less productive than the trips to Atlantic City. "What can you tell me?" I asked him. He rolled his eyes. Finally, Donald told me his editor wanted to meet with me. A lunch was set up, and I arrived at the restaurant thinking he and I were going to be discussing next steps. It was an expensive inn place in Midtown, and we were seated at a small, cramped table near the kitchen. With very little preliminary conversation, the editor told me that Random House wanted Donald to hire someone with more experience. "I've been working on this for a while," I said, "and I think I've made some progress. The problem is, I can't get Donald to sit down with me for an interview." "You can't expect to play a Mozart concerto the first time you sit down at a piano," the editor said, as if I'd just learned the alphabet the day before. "Donald told me he likes what I've done so far," I said. The editor looked at me as if I'd just proved his point for him. "Donald hasn't read any of it," he said. I stopped at the office the next day to clear out my desk and hand over anything that might be useful to my eventual replacement. I wasn't upset. I didn't even mind that Donald had had somebody else fire me. The project had hit a wall. Besides, after all of the time I had spent in his office, I still had no idea what he actually did. Chapter 10. Nightfall does not come at once. We were sitting at the same table at Mar-a-Lago where I had had lunch with Donald and Marla a couple of years earlier. The family had started going there for Easter. My grandfather turned to my grandmother, pointed to me, smiled, and asked, "Who is this nice lady?" He turned to me. "Aren't you a nice lady?" "Thank you, Grandpa," I said. Gam seemed upset. I told her not to worry. I'd already seen people my grandfather had known for decades erased from his memory. His youngest grandchildren, his driver. His new nickname for me stuck, and he called me Nice Lady until his final illness. He said it gently and with apparent kindness. He was very sweet to me after he'd forgotten who I was. "Come on, Pop." Rob took a step, but my grandfather didn't move. He looked around at the crowds of people at a gala thrown in my grandparents' honor, and his eyes glazed over with a look of sheer panic, as if he suddenly had no idea who anybody was or what he was doing there. Up until then, I had only seen my grandfather look contemptuous, annoyed, angry, amused, and self-satisfied. The look of fear was new and alarming. The only other time I had seen my grandfather look unsettled at all was on the one occasion Donald had taken him to play golf, a hobby that Donald spent an inordinate amount of time on, but that Fred, who had no use for pastimes, never complained about. I was at the house when they came back from the course, and I almost didn't recognize him. They were both wearing golf clothes, my grandfather in light blue pants, a white cardigan, and matching white shoes. It was the first time I'd ever seen my grandfather wearing something other than a suit. I'd never seen him look so uncomfortable and self-conscious before. Soon he'd go from habitually misplacing things and forgetting a word or a conversation here and there to forgetting familiar faces. You could measure your worth in my grandfather's eyes by how long he remembered you. I don't know if you remembered Dad, because I never once heard him mention my father in the years after his death. Marianne made sure my cousin David, by then a clinical psychologist, accompanied my grandfather to all of his appointments for checkups and neurological exams in a concerted effort to cement him in my grandfather's memory, but it didn't take long before my grandfather simply referred to David as the doctor. I was standing with Marianne and my grandfather by the pool at Mar-a-Lago when he pointed to me and said to his daughter, "Isn't she a nice lady?" A year or so had passed since he'd first given me the sobriquet. "Yes, Dad," Marianne said. She smiled wearily. He looked at her carefully and, almost as an afterthought, asked, "Who are you?" Her eyes watered as if somebody had slapped her. "Dad," she said gently, "it's Marianne." "Okay, Marianne." He smiled, but the name didn't mean anything to him anymore. He never forgot Donald. Rob, who'd left his position as president of Trump's Castle, of the infamous $3.15 million chip bailout, under a cloud, had sat in for my grandfather at Trump management during his 1991 hospitalization and never left. It was a good gig for Robert. In addition to the millions of dollars a year he got simply by virtue of the fact that he was one of Fred's living children, he was also paid $500,000 a year to do a job that required little skill or effort. It was the position for which Freddie and then Donald had been groomed and had rejected, each in his own way. Fred still went to the office every day and sat behind his desk until it was time to go home, but Rob was, actually, if not nominally, in charge of the well-oiled, self-sustaining machine he often referred to as a cash cow. My grandfather was having a bad day. Most of us were gathered in the library when he came down the stairs, his mustache and eyebrows freshly dyed, and his wig askew, but impeccably dressed in his three-piece suit. The hair color and wig were recent innovations. My grandfather had always been vain about his appearance and bemoaned his receding hairline. Now, his full head of hair gave him a slightly shaggy appearance. Nobody said much about the wig, but the hair dye caused considerable consternation in the family, especially when we were going out in public. My grandfather often left the cheap drugstore dye on too long, turning his eyebrows and mustache a jarring shade of magenta. When he joined us in the library, obviously proud of what he'd done, Gam said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, Fred." "Jesus Christ, Dad," Donald yelled at him. "For fuck's sake," Rob swore under his breath. Marianne, touching his arm, said, "Dad, you can't do that again." He was standing by his love seat when I came into the library. "Hello," he said. "Hi, Grandpa. How are you?" He looked at me and reached for his wallet. So thick with bills, I was constantly surprised that it fit in his pocket. He carried a wallet-sized photograph of a half-naked woman in his billfold, and for a second I was worried that he planned to show it to me, as he had when I was 12. "Look at this," he had said, sliding the picture out of its slot. A heavily made-up woman, who couldn't have been more than 18 and might have been younger, smiled innocently at the camera, her hands holding up her naked breasts. Donald had been looking over my grandfather's shoulder. I hadn't known what to say, and had looked at him for some indication of how I should respond, but he'd merely leered at the picture. "What do you think about that?" My grandfather had chuckled. I never heard him laugh. I don't think he ever did. He usually expressed amusement by saying, "Ha," and then sneering. Now, instead of a picture, my grandfather pulled out a $100 bill and asked, "Can I borrow your hair?" That was something he'd ask me every time I saw him when I was growing up. I laughed. "Sorry, Grandpa, I need to hang on to it." Elizabeth walked over carrying a small box in one hand. She looped an arm around my grandfather's elbow and leaned against him. He looked ahead blankly, disengaged his arm, and left the room. Shortly after, Donald came in with his kids and Rob's stepson. With the exception of Eric, they were all teenagers, the boys, tall and chubby and wearing suits. Donald went to sit on the chair by the TV, and Ivanka climbed on his lap. The boys started wrestling. Donald watched the action from his chair, kissing Ivanka or pinching her cheek. Every once in a while, he'd stick his foot out and kick whichever boy was being pinned to the floor. When they had been younger, Donald had wrestled with them, a fight that had basically consisted of his picking them up, throwing them on the ground, and kneeling on them until they cried uncle. As soon as they had gotten big enough to fight back in earnest, he had opted out. When Liz and I were as far out of harm's way as we could get, She held out the box to me and said, "This is yours." We didn't exchange gifts outside of Christmas, but I took the box from her, curious, and opened it to find a vintage stainless steel Timex with a small plain face and an olive green band. "Somebody gave it to you for Christmas," she said. "You were only 10, and I thought you were too young to have something that nice. So I took it." She left the room to look for her father. Later, Donald and Rob huddled together in the breakfast room, their shoulders close and their heads down. My grandfather stood nearby, leaning forward, almost on the tips of his toes, trying to hear what they were saying. Fred said, "Donald, Donald." When he didn't respond, my grandfather tugged on Donald's sleeve. "What, Dad?" he said without turning around. "Look at this," Fred said. He held up a page that had been torn out of a magazine, an ad for a limo similar to the one he already owned. "What about it?" Donald asked. "Can I get this?" Donald took the page and handed it to Rob, who folded it in half and slid it onto the table. "Sure, Pop," Rob said. Donald left the room. Whatever had once tied them together, Fred's remaining sons had given up all pretense of caring what their father thought or wanted. Having served his father's purpose, Donald now treated him with contempt, as if his mental decline were somehow his own fault. Fred had treated his oldest son and his alcoholism the same way, so Donald's attitude wasn't surprising. It was jarring, though, to witness the open contempt. As far as I knew at the time, Donald not only had been my grandfather's favorite, he had also seemed to be the only child of his that he liked. I knew my grandfather could be cruel, but I thought the largest measure of that cruelty was reserved for my father, who, to my shame, I thought had probably deserved it. I didn't know how lonely and frightening life in the house had been at the time of my grandmother's illness all those years ago. I didn't know that my grandfather hadn't taken care of any of his children during the year of Gam's absence, or that Donald had been particularly vulnerable to that neglect. And far from supporting and nurturing my father as he ventured out into the world with a sincere intent to be a success, Fred was really only enabling Donald, waiting until he was old enough to be of use. In 1994, I moved from my Upper East Side apartment to Garden City, a town on Long Island only a 15-minute drive from the house. I would take Gam to see her great-grandchildren, my brother's daughter and son, driving her in the red Rolls-Royce my grandfather had bought for her birthday a few years earlier. Behind the large, loose walnut steering wheel, I felt so high up that I could practically see the curvature of the earth. Sometimes Gam and I chatted easily during the 45-minute drive, but more often she was moody and taciturn. On days like that, the trip felt interminable. She sometimes smelled strongly of vanilla, even when she hadn't been baking. Other times, I would see her out of the corner of my eye surreptitiously slide her hand into her purse and put something into her mouth. Usually, we sat in the library chatting. I was often there when Marianne made her daily phone call to check in. After answering, Gam covered the receiver and said to me, "It's Marianne," then to her daughter, "Guess who's here? Mary." She paused, I guess to give Marianne a chance to say something such as, "Tell her I say hi," but she never did. Sometimes we went to eat at a local restaurant. One of Gam's favorite places to have lunch was the Sly Fox Inn, a low-key pub directly across the street from the grocery store parking lot where she'd been mugged. We never talked about Dad much, but one day she seemed particularly nostalgic. She reminisced about the trouble he and Billy Drake used to get into, how easily Dad had made her laugh. She went quiet after the waiter came to take our plates. When he asked if we wanted the check, Gam didn't answer, so I nodded. "Mary, he was so sick." "I know, Gam," I said, assuming she meant his drinking. "I didn't know what to do," she said. I thought she was going to cry and said uselessly, "Gam, it's okay." Those last few weeks, she took a deep breath. He couldn't get out of bed. "The day I came by?" I started to ask. The waiter brought the check. "Didn't he go to the doctor?" I asked. "I mean, if he was that sick?" "He felt so bad when he heard you'd come to see him." I waited for her to say something else, but Gam opened her purse. She always paid for lunch. I drove her home in silence. In 1987, I had spent my junior year abroad in Germany, a place for which I had no affinity, but I'd thought it might please my grandfather since it was the country of his parents' birth. It didn't. I had planned to come home for Christmas, and I called my grandparents to ask if I could stay with them. I'd stood at the payphone in the hallway of my dorm with a handful of 5-mark coins and called the house. "Hi, Grandpa, it's Mary," I'd said when he answered. "Yes," he had replied. I explained why I was calling. "Why can't you stay with your mother?" he had asked. "I'm allergic to the cats and I'm afraid I might have an asthma attack." "Then tell her to get rid of the cats." It was so much easier being the nice lady now. I saw firsthand how difficult living with my grandfather had become for Gam. My grandfather's odd behavior had started with small things, such as hiding her checkbook. When she confronted him, he accused her of trying to bankrupt him. When she tried to reason with him, he became enraged, leaving her feeling shaken and unsafe. He worried constantly about money, terrified that his fortune was disappearing. My grandfather had never been poor a day in his life, but poverty became his sole preoccupation. He was tortured by the prospect of it. My grandfather's moods eventually evened out, and the problem for Gam became the repetition. After getting home from the office in the evening, he'd go upstairs to change, often coming back downstairs wearing a fresh dress shirt and tie, but no pants, just his boxers, socks, and dress shoes. "So, how is everybody? Okay?" "Okay. Good night, Toots," he'd say, and head back upstairs, only to descend again a few minutes later. One evening, as Gam and I sat together in the library, my grandfather came in and asked, "Hey, Toots, what's for dinner?" After she answered, he walked out. A few minutes later, he returned. "What's for dinner?" She answered again. He left and returned 10, 12, 15 times. With decreasing amounts of patience, she told him, "Roast beef and potatoes every time." Eventually, she lashed out at him. "For God's sake, Fred, stop it. I've already told you." Okay, Toots," he said with a nervous laugh, hands raised against her as he bounced up on his toes. "Well, that's that," he said, tucking his thumbs under his suspenders, as though we had just finished a conversation. The gestures were the same as they'd always been, but the glint in his eyes had become dully benign. He left the room, only to wander in a few minutes later to ask, "What's for dinner?" Gam pulled me onto the porch, an uninviting square of cement on the side of the house just off the library that decades earlier had been used for family barbecues. It had been so long neglected that I often forgot it existed. "I swear, Mary," she told me, "he's going to drive me mad." The chairs that had been left out there and long forgotten were so littered with twigs and dead leaves that we remained standing. "You need to get help," I said. "You should talk to someone." "I can't leave him." She was close to tears. "I would have liked to go home again," she once told me wistfully. I didn't understand why she couldn't go back to Scotland, but she adamantly refused to do anything that might look selfish. On weekends, if they weren't at Mar-a-Lago, my grandparents would drive to one of their other children's country homes, Robert's in Millbrook, New York, Elizabeth's in Southampton, or Mary Ann's in Sparta, New Jersey. They would plan to spend the night, and my grandmother would look forward to a quiet, relaxing weekend with other people. As soon as they arrived at their destination, my grandfather would ask if they could go home. He wouldn't relent until Gam gave up and they got back into the car. The idea of a weekend or day retreat had been for Gam's benefit, a chance to get her out of the house and have company. Eventually, the visits became just another form of torture. Like so much else in the family that didn't make sense, they continued doing it anyway. Gam was in the hospital again. I don't remember what she'd broken, but after the hospital stay, she had the option of going to a rehab facility or having a physical therapist sent to her home. She opted for the rehab facility. Anything to avoid going back to the house, she told me. It was better that way. After the mugging, she had had to sleep in a hospital bed in the library for weeks. My grandfather, who'd recovered very well from his hip surgery, hadn't had much to say in the way of commiseration or comfort. "Everything's great, right, Toots?" he'd say. In 1998, we celebrated Father's Day at Donald's apartment at Trump Tower for the first time. It had become too difficult for my grandfather to be in public, so our traditional trip to Peter Luger in Brooklyn was out of the question. It was a family custom to go there twice a year, on Father's Day and my grandfather's birthday. Peter Luger was a deeply strange, very expensive restaurant that charged extra for bad service and accepted only cash, check, or a Peter Luger charge card, which my grandfather possessed. The menu was limited, and whether you asked for them or not, huge platters of sliced beefsteak tomatoes and white onions arrived, accompanied by tiny ceramic dishes of hash fries and creamed spinach that usually went untouched. A side of beef was brought out on trays, punctuated with little plastic cows in varying shades ranging from red, still mooing, and pink, almost able to crawl across the table, to, actually I don't know, all of our little cows were red and pink. Most of us ordered Cokes, which were served in 6-ounce bottles. Because of the legendarily bad service, that meant at the end of the evening the table was littered with the wreckage of a couple of cow carcasses, dozens of Coke bottles, and plates full of food nobody in my family ever ate. The meal wasn't over until my grandfather had sucked the marrow out of the bones, which, given his mustache, was a sight to behold. Since I'd stopped eating meat in college, dinner at Peter Luger had become a challenge. I'd once made the mistake of ordering salmon, which took up half the table and tasted about as good as you might expect salmon from a steakhouse would taste. Eventually, my meal consisted of Coke, the little potatoes, and an iceberg wedge salad. I wouldn't miss the rude waiters, but I hoped there would at least be something for me to eat at Donald's. I made the mistake of arriving at the penthouse early and alone. Although Donald and Marla were still married, she was already a distant memory, replaced by his new girlfriend, Melania, a 28-year-old Slovenian model whom I'd never met. They sat on an uncomfortable-looking love seat in the foyer, a large, undefined space. Everything was marble, gold leaf, mirrored walls, white walls, and frescoes. I'm not sure how he managed it, but Donald's apartment felt even colder and less like a home than the house did. Melania was 5 years younger than I was. She sat slightly sideways next to Donald with her ankles crossed. I was struck by how smooth she looked. After Robert and Blaine had met her for the first time, Rob told me that Melania had barely spoken throughout the entire meal. "Maybe her English isn't very good," I said. "No," he scoffed. "She knows what she's there for." Clearly, it wasn't for her sparkling conversation. As soon as I sat down, Donald started telling Melania about the time he'd hired me to write The Art of the Comeback, and then launched into his version of my Back from the Brink redemption story. He thought it was something we had in common. We'd both hit rock bottom, and then somehow clawed our way back to the top, in his case, or just back, in mine. "You dropped out of college, right?" "Yes, Donald, I did." It was exactly how I wanted to be introduced to somebody I'd never met. I was also surprised he even knew about it. "It was really bad for a while," he said, "and then she started doing drugs." "Whoa," I said, holding up my hands. "Really?" said Melania, suddenly interested. No, I've never done drugs in my life." He slid me a look and smiled. He was embellishing the story for effect, and he knew I knew it. "She was a total disaster," he said, smiling more broadly. Donald loved comeback stories, and he understood that the deeper the hole you crawled out of, the better billing your triumphant comeback would get, which was exactly how he experienced his own journey. By conflating my dropping out of college and his hiring me to write his book, while throwing in a fictional drug addiction, he concocted a better story that somehow had him playing the role of my savior. Of course, between my dropping out of school and his hiring me, I dropped back into school, graduated, and gotten a master's degree. There was no point in setting the record straight, however. There never was with him. The story was for his benefit as much as anybody else's, and by the time the doorbell rang, he probably already believed his version of events. When the three of us rose to greet the new guests, I realized that Melania had said only one word during our time together. On June 11th, 1999, Fritz called to tell me our grandfather had been taken to Long Island Jewish Medical Center, another Queens hospital my grandparents had patronized in recent years. He said it was likely the end. I drove the 10 minutes from my house and found that the room was already full. Gam sat in the only chair near the bed. Elizabeth stood next to her, holding my grandfather's hand. After saying hello, I stood by the window next to Robert's wife, Blaine. She said, "We're supposed to be in London with Prince Charles." I realized she was talking to me, something she rarely did. "Oh," I said. "He invited us to one of his polo matches. I can't believe we had to cancel." She sounded exasperated and made no effort to lower her voice. I could have topped that story. In a week, I was supposed to be getting married on a beach in Maui. Nobody in the family knew. They'd always been spectacularly uninterested in my personal life. When necessary, I asked a guy friend to accompany me to my family occasion that required a +1, and never asked about my boyfriends or relationships. A couple of years earlier, Gam and I had been talking about Princess Diana's funeral, and when she had said with some vehemence, "It's a disgrace they're letting that little faggot Elton John sing at the service," I'd realized it was better that she didn't know I was living with and engaged to a woman. Seeing how serious my grandfather's condition was, I had a terrible feeling that when I got home, I'd have to break the news to my fiancé that, after months of planning and overcoming several logistical nightmares, our mostly secret wedding would have to be postponed. I noticed a hush in the room, as if everybody had run out of small talk at the same time. We were reduced for the moment to listening to my grandfather's uneven breathing, a ragged, uncertain inhalation, followed by an unnatural pause for longer than seemed safe, until finally he exhaled. Chapter 11. The Only Currency. Fred Trump died on June 25th, 1999. The following day, his obituary was published in the New York Times under the banner, "Fred C. Trump, post-war master builder of housing for middle class, dies at 93. The obituary writer made a point of contrasting Fred's status as a self-made man with his flamboyant son Donald. My grandfather's propensity for picking up unused nails at his construction sites to hand back to his carpenters the next day was noted before the details of his birth. The Times also repeated the family line that Donald had built his own business with minimal help from my grandfather, a small amount of money, a statement that the paper itself would refute 20 years later. We sat in the library, each with our own copy of the Times. Robert was raked over the coals by his siblings for having told the Times that my grandfather's estate was worth between $250 million and $300 million. Never give them numbers, Marianne lectured him, as if he were a stupid kid. He stood there shamefaced, cracking his knuckles and bouncing on the balls of his feet, just as my grandfather used to do, as if suddenly imagining the ensuing tax bill. The valuation was absurdly low. Eventually, we would learn that the empire was probably worth 4 times that, but Marianne and Donald would never have admitted that it was even that much. Later, we stood upstairs in the Madison Room at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the most exclusive and expensive bereavement services provider in the city, smiling and shaking hands as a seemingly endless line of visitors passed through. Overall, more than 800 people moved through the rooms. Some were there to pay their respects, including rival real estate developers such as Sam Lefrak, New York Governor George Pataki, former Senator Al D'Amato, and comedian and future Celebrity Apprentice contestant Joan Rivers. The rest were most likely there to catch a glimpse of Donald. On the day of the funeral, Marble Collegiate Church was filled to capacity. During the service, from beginning to end, everyone had a role to play. It was all extremely well choreographed. Elizabeth read my grandfather's favorite poem, and the rest of the siblings gave eulogies, as did my brother, who spoke on behalf of my dad, and my cousin David, who represented the grandchildren. Mostly they told stories about my grandfather, although my brother was the only one who came close to humanizing him. For the most part, in ways both oblique and direct, the emphasis was on my grandfather's material success, his killer instinct, and his talent for saving a buck. Donald was the only one to deviate from the script. In a cringe-inducing turn, his eulogy devolved into a paean to his own greatness. It was so embarrassing that Marianne later told her son not to allow any of her siblings to speak at her funeral. Rudolph Giuliani, New York City's mayor at the time, also spoke. When the service was over, the 6 oldest grandchildren, Tiffany was too young, accompanied the casket to the hearse as honorary pallbearers, which meant, as was often the case in our family, that others did the heavy lifting while we got the credit. All of the streets, from 5th Avenue and 45th Street to the Midtown Tunnel, more than 16 blocks away, had been closed to cars and pedestrians, so our motorcade with a police escort slid easily out of the city. It was a quick trip to All Faith Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, for the burial. We drove back to the city just as quickly, but with less fanfare, for lunch at Donald's apartment. Afterward, I accompanied my grandmother back to the house. The two of us sat in the library and chatted for a while. She seemed tired but relieved. It had been a very long day, a very long few years, actually. Other than the live-in maid, who was asleep upstairs, it was just the two of us. I was supposed to be on my honeymoon. I stayed with her until she was ready to go to bed. When she said she was ready for bed, I asked her if she wanted me to stay, or if there was anything I could get for her before I left. "No, dear, I'm fine." I bent over to kiss her cheek. She smelled like vanilla. "You were my favorite person," I told her. It wasn't true, but I said it because I loved her. I said it, too, because nobody else had bothered to stay with her after her husband of 63 years had been put in the ground. "Good," she replied. "I should be." And then I left her alone, in that large, quiet, empty house. 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I was home when a DHL truck pulled up and delivered a yellow envelope containing a copy of my grandfather's will. I read through it twice to be sure I hadn't misunderstood anything. I had promised my brother I'd call him as soon as I knew anything, but I was reluctant to do so. Fritz and Lisa's third child, William, had been born hours after my grandfather's funeral. 24 hours after that, he'd begun having seizures. He had been in the neonatal intensive care unit ever since. They had 2 young children at home, and Fritz had to work. I had no idea how they were managing all of it. I hated to be the bearer of more bad news, but he needed to know. I called him. "So what's the deal?" he asked. "Nothing," I told him. We got nothing. A few days later, I got a call from Rob. As far as I could remember, he had only ever called me before to let me know when Gam was in the hospital. He acted as if everything were fine. If I signed off on the will, he implied, everything would be great. And he did need my signature in order for the will to be released for probate. Though it's true that my grandfather disinherited me and my brother, that is, instead of splitting what would have been my father's 20% share of his estate between me and my brother, he had divided it evenly among his 4 other children. We were included in a bequest made separately to all of the grandchildren, an amount that proved to be less than 0.1% of what my aunts and uncles had inherited. In the context of the entire estate, it was a very small amount of money, and it must have infuriated Robert that it gave me and Fritz the power to hold up the distribution of the assets. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to sign. In the breadth and concision of its cruelty, the will was a stunning document that very much resembled my parents' divorce agreement. For a while, Robert called me every day. Marianne and Donald had assigned him to be the point person. Donald didn't want to be bothered, and Marianne's husband, John, had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and his prognosis was not good. "Cash in your chips, honey bunch," Rob said repeatedly, as if that would make me forget what was in the will. No matter how many times he said it, though, my brother and I had agreed not to sign anything until we had some idea of what our options were. Eventually, Rob began to lose patience. Fritz and I were holding everything up. The will couldn't go to probate until all of the beneficiaries had signed off. When I told Rob that Fritz and I weren't yet willing to take that step, he suggested we get together to discuss it. At our first meeting, when we asked Rob to explain why my grandfather had done what he had, Rob said, "Listen, your grandfather didn't give a shit about you. And not just you. He didn't give a shit about any of his grandchildren." "We're being treated worse because our father died," I said. "No, not at all." When we pointed out that our cousins would still benefit from what their parents were getting from my grandfather, Rob said, "Any one of them could be disowned at any time. Donnie was going to join the army or some bullshit like that, and Donald and Ivana told him if he did, they'd disown him in a second." "Our father didn't have that luxury," I said. Rob sat back. I could see him trying to recalibrate. "It's pretty simple," he said. "As far as your grandfather was concerned, dead is dead. He only cared about his living children." I wanted to point out that my grandfather hadn't cared about Rob either, but Fritz intervened. "Rob," he said, "this just isn't fair." I lost track of how many meetings the three of us had between July and October 1999. There was a brief respite in September while I was in Hawaii for my postponed wedding and honeymoon. At the very beginning of our discussions, Fritz, Robert, and I agreed that we would leave Gam out of it. I assumed she had no idea how we'd been treated in my grandfather's will, and saw no reason to upset her. Hopefully, we would be able to resolve everything, and she'd never have to know there had been a problem at all. I spoke to her every day while I was away, and once back in New York, resumed my visits to her. The negotiations, if they could even be called that, also resumed. There was a numbing sameness to our conversations. No matter what Fritz and I said, Rob came back with his cliches and canned responses. We remained at a standstill. I asked him about Midland Associates, the management company my grandfather had set up decades earlier in order to avoid paying certain taxes and benefit his children. Midland owned a group of 7 buildings, including Sunnyside Towers and the Highlander, that were referred to in my family as the mini-empire. I knew very little about it. None of my trustees had ever explained what role it played or how money was generated, but I received a check every few months. We wanted to know how or if my grandfather's death would affect the partnership going forward. We weren't asking for a specific dollar amount or a percentage of the estate, just some assurance that the assets we already had would be secure in the future, and if, given the family's enormous wealth, there was anything they could see their way clear to doing as far as my grandfather's estate was concerned. As the executors and, along with Elizabeth, sole beneficiaries, Marianne, Donald, and Robert had a wide latitude in that area, but Rob remained noncommittal. At our final meeting, in the bar of the Drake Hotel on 56th Street and Park Avenue, it was clear that Robert had begun to understand that we weren't going to back down. Prior to that, despite the unpleasant things he'd been saying to us, he had maintained an affable, "Hey kids, I'm just the messenger" attitude. That day, he reminded us, once again, that my grandfather had hated our mother and had been afraid his money would fall into her hands. That was laughable, because for more than 25 years, my mother had lived according to the terms the Trumps had set, following their directions to the letter. She had lived in the same poorly maintained apartment in Jamaica, Queens. Her alimony and child support payments had rarely been increased, yet she had never asked for more. Finally, Fred had disowned us because he could. The people who'd been assigned to protect us, at least financially, were our trustees, Marianne, Donald, Robert, and Erwin Durbin, but they apparently had no interest in protecting us, especially at their own expense. Rob leaned forward, suddenly serious. "Listen, if you don't sign this will, if you think of suing us, we will bankrupt Midland Associates, and you will be paying taxes on money you don't have for the rest of your lives." There was nothing left to say after that. Either Fritz and I gave in, or we fought. Neither option was a good one. We consulted with Erwin, who felt like the only ally we had left. He was incensed about how poorly our grandfather had treated us in the will. When we told him how Robert had responded when asked about Midland Associates and our share in other Trump entities, he said, "Your share of the ground leases under Shore Haven and Beach Haven alone are priceless. If they're not going to do anything for you, you're going to have to sue them." I had no idea what a ground lease was, let alone that I had a share in 2 of them, but I knew what priceless meant, and I trusted Erwin. Based on his recommendation, Fritz and I made a decision. After all those months, William was still in the hospital, and Fritz and Lisa were feeling overwhelmed. I told him I'd take care of it, and called Rob that afternoon. "Is there anything you guys can do, Rob?" I asked. "Sign the will, and we'll see." "Really?" "Your father's dead," he said. "I know he's dead, Rob, but we're not." I was so sick of having that conversation. He paused. "Marianne, Donald, and I are simply following Dad's wishes. Your grandfather didn't want you or Fritz, or especially your mother, to get anything." I took a deep breath. "This is going nowhere," I said. "Fritz and I are going to hire an attorney." As if a switch had been flipped, Robert screamed, "You do whatever the fuck you need to do," and slammed the phone down. The next day, there was a message from Gam on my answering machine when I got home. "Mary, it's your grandmother," she said tersely. She never referred to herself that way. It was always Gam. I called her back right away. "Your Uncle Robert tells me you and your brother are suing for 20% of your grandfather's estate." I felt blindsided and said nothing right away. Obviously, Rob had broken our agreement and told my grandmother his version of what we'd been discussing. But the other thing that held me up was that my grandmother spoke as if our getting what would have been my father's share of the estate was somehow wrong and unseemly. I was confused about loyalty, about love, about the limits of both. I thought I was part of the family. I'd gotten it all wrong. "Gam, we haven't asked for anything. I don't know what Rob told you, but we're not suing anybody." "You'd better not be. We're just trying to figure this out, that's all." "Do you know what your father was worth when he died?" she said. "A whole lot of nothing." There was a pause, and then a click. She'd hung up on me. Chapter 12. The Debacle. I sat there with the phone in my hand, not knowing what to do next. It was one of those moments that changes everything, both what came before and what will come after, and it was too big to process. I called my brother, and as soon as I heard his voice, I burst into tears. He called Gam to see if he could explain what we were really asking for, but they had basically the same conversation. Her parting shot to him was slightly different, though. When your father died, he didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. In the world of my family, that was the only thing that mattered. If your only currency is money, that's the only lens through which you determine worth. Somebody who is accomplished in that context as little as my father was worth nothing, even if he happened to be your son. Further, if my father died penniless, his children weren't entitled to anything. My grandfather had every right to change his will as he saw fit. My aunts and uncles had every right to follow his instructions to the letter, despite the fact that none of them deserved their share of Fred's fortune any more than my father did. If not for an accident of birth, none of them would have been a multimillionaire. Prosecutors and federal judges don't typically have $20 million cottages in Palm Beach. Executive assistants don't have weekend homes in Southampton. Although, to be fair, Marianne and Elizabeth were the only 2 of the siblings, other than my father, to work outside of the family business. Still, they acted as if they had earned every penny of my grandfather's wealth, and that money was so tied up in their sense of self-worth that letting any of it go was not an option. On Erwin's advice, we approached Jack Barnowski, a partner at Farrell Fritz, the largest law firm in Nassau County. Jack, a pompous, self-satisfied man, agreed to take us on as clients. His strategy was to prove that my grandfather's 1990 will should be overturned. Fred Trump had not been of sound mind at the time the will was signed, and he had been under the undue influence of his children. Less than a week after we served the executors, Jack received a letter from Lou Lorino, a short, wiry pit bull of a lawyer who was representing my grandfather's estate. The medical insurance that had been provided to us by Trump management since we were born had been revoked. Everyone in the Trump family was covered by it. My brother depended upon this insurance to pay for my nephew's crushing medical expenses. When William had first fallen ill, Robert had promised Fritz that they would take care of everything. He should just send the bills to the office. Taking away our insurance, which had been Marianne's idea, didn't benefit them at all. It was merely a way to cause us more pain and make us more desperate. William was out of the hospital by then, but he was still susceptible to seizures, which more than once had put him in a state of cardiac arrest so severe that he would not have survived without CPR. He still required round-the-clock nursing care. The family all knew this, but none of them objected, not even my grandmother, who was as aware as anybody that her own desperately ill great-grandchild would probably need expensive medical care for the rest of his life. Fritz and I had no choice but to launch another lawsuit to make them reinstate William's medical insurance. The suit required depositions and affidavits from the doctors and nurses responsible for William's care. It was time-consuming and stressful, and culminated in an appearance in front of a judge. Lorino defended the cancellation of the insurance by first claiming that we had no right to expect the insurance in perpetuity. It was, rather, a gift that had been bestowed upon us out of the goodness of my grandfather's heart. He also downplayed William's condition, insisting that the round-the-clock nurses who attended to William and had saved his life more than once were overpriced babysitters. If Fritz and Lisa were worried that their infant son might have another seizure, he said, they should just learn CPR. The depositions did nothing to help us. I couldn't believe what a terrible interlocutor Jack was. He failed to follow up and went off on tangents. Despite the fact that Fritz and I had prepared long lists of questions for him, he rarely, if ever, referred to them. Robert, much more detached than the last time I'd spoken to him, reiterated my grandfather's hatred of my mother as his central justification for the disinheritance. Marianne angrily referred to me and my brother as absentee grandchildren. I thought of all the times she had called the house when I was visiting my grandmother. Now I understood why she'd never told my grandmother to say hi. My grandfather, she said, had been furious with us because we had never spent time with our grandmother, completely ignoring the history of the last decade. Apparently, my grandfather had also hated that Fritz never wore a tie, and I, as a teenager, had dressed in baggy sweaters and jeans. When he was deposed, Donald didn't know or couldn't remember anything, a kind of strategic forgetfulness he has employed many times to evade blame or scrutiny. All three of them claimed in their sworn depositions that my grandfather had been sharp as a tack until just before he died. During that time, my Aunt Elizabeth ran into a family friend, who later relayed the exchange to my brother. "Can you believe what Fritz and Mary are doing?" she asked him. "All they care about is money." Of course, wills are about money. But in a family that has only one currency, wills are also about love. I thought Liz might have understood that. She had no power. Her opinion about the situation wouldn't have mattered to anybody but me and my brother, but it still hurt that she was towing the party line. Even a silent, powerless ally would have been better than none at all. After almost 2 years, with legal bills piling up, and having made no progress on any kind of settlement, we had to decide whether to take our family to court. William's condition remained serious, and a trial would have taken the kind of energy and focus my brother didn't have. Reluctantly, we decided to settle. Marianne, Donald, and Robert refused to settle unless we agreed to let them buy our shares of the assets we'd inherited from our father, his 20% of the mini-empire and the priceless ground leases. My aunts and uncles submitted a property valuation to Jack Barnowski, and, using their figures, he and Lou Lorino arrived at a settlement figure that was likely based on suspect numbers. Jack told us that, short of a trial, it was the best we could expect. "We know they're lying," he said, "but it's he said, she said. Besides, your grandfather's estate is only worth around $30 million. That was only a tenth of the estimate Robert had given the New York Times in 1999, which itself would turn out to be only 25% of the estate's actual value. Fred no doubt believed that my dad had been given the same tools, the same advantages, and the same opportunities as Donald had. If Freddie had thrown them all away, that wasn't his father's fault. If, despite them, my dad had continued to be a terrible provider, my brother and I should consider ourselves lucky that there were trust funds our father couldn't squander when he was alive. Whatever happened to us after that had nothing to do with Fred Trump. He had done his part. We had no right to expect more. While the lawsuits were still in progress, I received word that after a brief illness, Gam had died on August 7, 2000, at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, just as my grandfather had. She was 88. If I had known she was sick, I think I would have tried to see her, but the fact that she hadn't asked to see me clarified just how easy it had been for us to let each other go. We had never spoken after that last phone conversation, just as I had not spoken again to Robert, Donald, Marianne, or Elizabeth. It had never occurred to me to try. Fritz and I decided to attend Gam's funeral, but knowing we were unwelcome, we stood in one of the overflow rooms at the back of Marble Collegiate Church. Along with a couple of Donald's security guards, we watched the service on a closed-circuit monitor. The eulogies were remarkable only for what was not said. There was a lot of speculation about my grandparents' reunion in heaven, but my father, their oldest son, who had been dead for almost 27 years, was not mentioned at all. He didn't even appear in my grandmother's obituary. I received a copy of Gam's will a few weeks after she died. It was a carbon copy of my grandfather's, with one exception. My brother and I had been removed from the section outlining the bequest for her grandchildren. My father and his entire line had now been effectively erased. Part 4. The Worst Investment Ever Made. Chapter 13. The Political is Personal. Nearly a decade would pass before I saw my family again, in October 2009, at my cousin Ivanka's wedding to Jared Kushner. I had no idea why I'd received the invitation, which was printed on the same heavy-gauge stationery favored by the Trump Organization. As the limo I'd taken from my home on Long Island approached the clubhouse at Donald's Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, which looked eerily like the house, I was unsure what to expect. Ushers handed out black shawls, which made me feel a little less exposed as I wrapped one around my shoulders. The outdoor ceremony took place beneath a large white tent. Gilt chairs were lined up in rows on either side of a gilt-trimmed runway carpet. The traditional Jewish chuppah, covered in white roses, was about the size of my house. Donald stood awkwardly in a yarmulke. Before the vows, Jared's father, Charles, who'd been released from prison 3 years earlier, rose to tell us that when Jared had first introduced him to Ivanka, he had thought she would never be good enough to join his family. It was only after she had committed to converting to Judaism and worked hard to make it happen that he had begun to think she might be worthy of them after all. Considering that Charles had been convicted of hiring a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law, taping their illicit encounter, and then sending the recording to his sister at his nephew's engagement party, I found his condescension a bit out of line. After the ceremony, my brother, my sister-in-law, and I entered the clubhouse. As I walked down the hallway, I saw my Uncle Rob. My last exchange with him had been when he'd hung up on me in 1999 after I had told him that Fritz and I were hiring a lawyer to contest my grandfather's will. As I approached him now, he surprised me by breaking into a smile. He put his hand out, then leaned down — he was much taller than I was, even in my heels — shook my hand, and kissed me on the cheek.
Honey Bunch,
How are you? He said brightly. Before I could answer, he said, You know, I've been thinking that the statute of limitations on family estrangement has passed. Then, bouncing on the balls of his feet, he smacked a closed fist into his open palm in a not quite accurate imitation of my grandfather. That sounds good to me, I said. We spent a couple of minutes exchanging pleasantries. When we were done, I walked up the stairs to the cocktail reception, where I spotted Donald speaking to somebody I recognized, a mayor or a governor, although I can't recall who it was. Hi, Donald, I said as I walked toward them. Mary, you look great. He shook my hand and kissed my cheek, as Rob had. It's good to see you. It's good to see you, too. It was a relief to discover that things between us were pleasant and civil. Having established that, I gave way to the next person in the lengthening line of people, some of them waiting to congratulate the father of the bride. But The Apprentice had just concluded its 8th season, so it's just as likely that many of them were simply there for the photo op. Have fun, he called after me as I walked away. The reception was being held in an enormous ballroom, quite a distance from the hors d'oeuvres. Along the way, I saw my Aunt Liz in the distance, chasing after her husband. I caught her eye and waved. She waved back and said, Hi, sweetie pie. But she didn't stop, and that was the last I saw of her. I walked past voluminous bunting and the highly polished dance floor, and finally found my place at the second cousin's table on the periphery of the ballroom. In the distance, I could hear the occasional thwap of rotors as helicopters landed and took off. After the first course had been served, I decided to find Mary Ann. As I wound my way through the tables, Donald took to the stage to give his toast. If I hadn't known who he was talking about, I would have thought he was toasting his secretary's daughter. I spotted Mary Ann and paused. Fritz and I would not have been invited to Ivanka's wedding without Mary Ann's approval. She didn't see me until I was standing right in front of her. Hi, Aunt Mary Ann. It took her a few seconds to realize who I was. Mary. She didn't smile. How are you? She asked, her expression rigid. Everything's great. My daughter just turned 8 and I didn't know you had a daughter. Of course you didn't know I had a daughter, or that I was raising her with the woman I'd married after my grandfather's funeral and then divorced, or that I had recently received my doctorate in clinical psychology. But she acted as if her lack of such knowledge was an insult to her. The rest of our brief conversation was equally tense. She mentioned that Ivana had missed Ivanka's wedding shower, but said, sotto voce, that she couldn't discuss why. I retreated to my table, and when I realized the vegetarian meal I'd ordered had not arrived, I ordered a martini in its stead. The olives would suffice. Sometime later, I saw Mary Ann, looking determined, head toward us as if on a mission. She walked straight up to my brother and said, We need to talk about the elephant in the room. Then, gesturing to include me, the 3 of us. A few weeks after Ivanka and Jared's wedding, Fritz and I met with Mary Ann and Robert at her apartment on the Upper East Side. It wasn't clear to me why Rob was there, but I thought perhaps he planned to make good on his claim that the statute of limitations on family estrangement had passed. I took it as a good sign, but as the afternoon wore on, I became less sure. We didn't discuss anything that seemed pertinent. As we sat in the living room with its spectacular view of Central Park and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Mary Ann made passing references to the debacle, as she called the lawsuit, but nobody else seemed eager to go down that road. Rob leaned forward in his chair, and I hoped finally we were going to start dealing with the so-called elephant in the room. Instead, he told a story. 10 years earlier, Rob had still been working for Donald in Atlantic City when Donald's financial situation was dire. His investors were getting hammered, the banks were after him, and his personal life was in shambles. When things were at their worst, Donald had called Rob with a request. Listen, Rob, I don't know how this is all going to end, he had said, but it's tough, and I might drop dead of a heart attack. If anything happens to me, I want you to make sure Marla will be okay. Sure, Donald, just tell me what you want me to do. Get her $10 million. I thought, holy shit, that's a lot of money, at the same moment that Rob said, What a cheap bastard. Rob laughed at the memory as I sat there stunned, wondering how much money those people had. Last I'd heard, $10 million would have been 1/3 of my grandfather's entire estate. Around the same time, Marianne said, Donald called to tell me I was one of his 3 favored people. Apparently, he forgot he had 3 children. Tiffany and Barron were still to come. We never met with Rob again, but Fritz and I, separately and together, had lunch occasionally with Marianne. For the first time in my life, I got to know my aunt. Not since I'd spent time with Donald while I was writing his book had I felt a little bit as though I were part of the family. A couple of months after my aunt's April 2017 birthday party, I was in my living room lacing up my sneakers when the front doorbell rang. I don't know why I answered it. I almost never did. 75% of the time it was a Jehovah's Witness or Mormon missionaries. The rest of the time it was somebody wanting me to sign a petition. When I opened the door, the only thing that registered was that the woman standing there, with her shock of curly blonde hair and dark-rimmed glasses, was someone I didn't know. Her khakis, button-down shirt, and messenger bag placed her out of Rockville Center. Hi, my name is Suzanne Craig. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. Journalists had stopped contacting me a long time before. With the exception of David Korn from Mother Jones and somebody from Frontline, the only other person to leave a message before the election had been from Inside Edition. Nothing I had to say about my uncle would have mattered before November 2016. Why would anybody want to hear from me now? The futility of it annoyed me, so I said, "It is so not cool that you're showing up at my house. I understand, I'm sorry, but we're working on a very important story about your family's finances, and we think you could really help us. I can't talk to you. At least take my card. If you change your mind, you can call me any time." "I don't talk to reporters," I said. I took her card anyway. A few weeks later, I fractured the 5th metatarsal of my left foot. For the next 4 months, I was a prisoner in my home, my foot elevated at all times as I sat on the couch. I received a letter from Suzanne Craig reiterating her belief that I had documents that could help rewrite the history of the President of the United States, as she put it. I ignored the letter, but she persisted. After a month of sitting on the couch, scrolling through Twitter with the news constantly on in the background, I watched in real time as Donald shredded norms, endangered alliances, and trod upon the vulnerable. The only thing about it that surprised me was the increasing number of people willing to enable him. As I watched our democracy disintegrating and people's lives unraveling because of my uncle's policies, I kept thinking about Suzanne Craig's letter. I found her business card and called her. I told her that I wanted to help, but I no longer had any documents relating to our lawsuit years before. Jack Barnoski might still have them, she said. 10 days later, I was on my way to his office. The headquarters of Farrell Fritz was located in one of 2 oblong buildings sheathed in blue glass. Bitterly cold air pushed between them across the wide-open space of the enormous parking lot. It's impossible to park anywhere near the entrance, so after I found a spot, it took me 10 minutes to get to the lobby on my crutches. I negotiated the escalator and the marble floors very carefully. By the time I arrived at my destination, I was tired and overheated. 30 bankers' boxes lined 2 walls and filled a bookshelf. The room's only other contents were a desk and a chair. Jack's secretary had kindly put out a pad of paper, a pen, and some paper clips. I dropped my bags, leaned my crutches against the wall, and half fell into the desk chair. None of the boxes was labeled. I had no idea where to start. It took me about an hour to familiarize myself with the contents of the boxes and compile a list, which required wheeling around the room on my chair and lifting boxes onto the desk while standing on one leg. When Jack stopped by, I was flushed and soaking wet. He reminded me that I couldn't take any documents out of the room. "They belong to your brother, too," he said, "and I need his permission." which wasn't at all true. When he turned to leave, I called after him. "Jack, wait a second. Can you remind me why we decided to settle the lawsuit?" "Well, you were getting concerned about the cost, and as you know, we don't take cases on contingency. Although we knew they were lying to us, it was he said, she said. Besides, your grandfather's estate was only worth $30 million. It was almost word for word what he told me when I had last seen him almost 20 years earlier." "Ah, okay, thanks." I was holding in my hands documents that proved the estate had actually been worth close to $1 billion when he died. I just didn't know it yet. After I was sure he had gone, I grabbed copies of my grandfather's wills, floppy disks with all the depositions from the lawsuit, and some of my grandfather's bank records, all of which I was legally entitled to as part of the lawsuit, and stuffed them into my bags. Sue came by my house the next day to pick up the documents and drop off a burner phone so we could communicate more securely going forward. We weren't taking any chances. On my third trip to Farrell Fritz, I methodically went through every box and discovered that there were 2 copies of everything. I mentioned the fact to Jack's secretary and suggested that it obviated the need to get my brother's permission, which was a relief since I didn't want to involve him. I would leave a set of documents for him in the unlikely event he ever wanted one. I was just beginning to look for the list of materials the Times wanted when I got a message from Jack. I could take whatever I wanted as long as I left a copy. I hadn't been prepared for that. In fact, I had plans to meet Sue and her colleagues Russ Buettner and David Barstow, the other 2 journalists working on the story, at my house at 1 o'clock with whatever I'd managed to smuggle out. I texted Sue with the news that I'd be late. At 3 o'clock, I drove to the loading dock beneath the building, and 19 boxes were loaded into the back of the borrowed truck I was driving since I couldn't work the clutch in my own car. It was just beginning to get dark when I pulled into my driveway. The 3 reporters were waiting for me in David's white SUV, which sported a pair of reindeer antlers and a huge red nose wired to the grill. When I showed them the boxes, there were hugs all around. It was the happiest I'd felt in months. When Sue, Russ, and David left, I was exhausted and relieved. It had been a head-spinning few weeks. I hadn't fully grasped how much of a risk I was taking. If anybody in my family found out what I was doing, there would be repercussions. I knew how vindictive they were, but there was no way to gauge how serious the consequences might be. Anything would pale in comparison to what they'd already done. I finally felt as though I might be able to make a difference after all. In the past, there had been nothing I could do that would be significant enough, so I hadn't tried very hard. Because being good or doing good didn't count for much. Whatever you did had to be extraordinary. You couldn't just be a prosecutor. You had to be the best prosecutor in the country. You had to be a federal judge. You couldn't just fly planes. You had to be a professional pilot for a major carrier at the dawn of the jet age. For a long time, I blamed my grandfather for my feeling this way. But none of us realized that the expectation of being the best, in my grandfather's view, had applied only to my father, who had failed, and Donald, who had wildly exceeded Fred's expectations. When I finally realized that my grandfather didn't care what I accomplished or contributed, and that my own unrealistic expectations were paralyzing me, I still felt that only a grand gesture would set it right. It wasn't enough for me to volunteer at an organization helping Syrian refugees. I had to take Donald down. After the election, Donald called his big sister, ostensibly to find out how he was doing. Of course, he thought he already knew the answer. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made the call in the first place. He merely wanted her to confirm very strongly that he was doing a fantastic job. When she said, "Not that good," Donald immediately went on offense. "That's nasty," he said. She could see the sneer on his face. Then, seemingly apropos of nothing, he asked her, "Marianne, where would you be without me?" It was a smug reference to the fact that Marianne owed her first federal judgeship to Donald because Roy Cohn had done him, and her, a favor all those years ago. My aunt had always insisted that she'd earned her position on the bench entirely on her own merits, and she shot back at him. "If you say that one more time, I will level you." But it was an empty threat. Although Marianne had prided herself on being the only person on the planet Donald ever listened to, those days were long past, which was illustrated not long after, in June 2018. On the eve of Donald's first summit with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, Marianne called the White House and left a message with his secretary. "Tell him his older sister called with a little sisterly advice. Prepare. Learn from those who know what they're doing. Stay away from Dennis Rodman, and leave his Twitter at home." He ignored all of it. The Politico headline the following day read, "Trump says Kim meeting will be about attitude, not prep work." If Marianne had ever had any sway over her little brother, it was gone now. Aside from the requisite birthday call, they didn't speak much after that. While they were working on the article, the Times reporters invited me to join them for a tour of my grandfather's properties. On the morning of January 10th, 2018, they picked me up in David's SUV, still adorned with its antlers and red nose, at the Jamaica train station. We started at the Highlander, where I'd grown up, and over the course of the day, we traversed snowdrifts and patches of ice in an effort to visit as much of the Trump empire as possible. After 9 hours, we still hadn't managed to see all of it. I had traded in my crutches for a cane by then, but was still exhausted, mentally and physically, when I got home. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I'd always known that my grandfather owned buildings, but I'd had no idea just how many. More disturbing, my father had apparently owned 20% of some of the buildings I'd never heard of before. On October 2nd, 2018, the New York Times published an almost 14,000-word article, the longest in its history, revealing the long litany of potentially fraudulent and criminal activities my grandfather, aunts, and uncles had engaged in. Through the extraordinary reporting of the Times team, I learned more about my family's finances than I'd ever known. Donald's lawyer, Charles J. Harder, predictably denied the allegations, but the investigative reporters laid out a devastating case. Over the course of Fred's life, he and my grandmother had transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to their children. While my grandfather was alive, Donald alone had received the equivalent of $413 million, much of it through questionable means. Loans that he had never repaid, investments in properties that had never matured, essentially gifts that had never been taxed. That did not include the $170 million he had received through the sale of my grandfather's empire. The amounts of money the article mentioned were mind-boggling, and the 4 siblings had benefited for decades. Dad had clearly shared in the wealth early in his life, but he had had nothing left to show for it by the time he was 30. I have no idea what happened to his money. In 1992, only 2 years after Donald's attempt to attach the codicil to my grandfather's will, effectively cutting his siblings out, the 4 of them suddenly needed one another. After a lifetime of their fathers playing them off against one another, they finally had a common purpose: to protect their inheritance from the government. Fred had refused to heed his lawyer's advice to cede control of his empire to his children before his death in order to minimize estate taxes. That meant that Marianne, Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert would be responsible for potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of estate taxes. In addition to dozens of buildings, my grandfather had amassed extraordinary sums of cash. His properties carried no debt and brought in millions of dollars every year. The siblings' solution was to establish all-county building supply and maintenance. At that point, my grandfather was effectively sidelined by his increasing dementia, not that he would have objected to their scheme. And since my father was long gone, Marianne, Donald, and Robert could do whatever they wanted. They were our trustees, but there was no one to force them to fulfill their obligations to Fritz and me, and they could easily keep us out of the loop. My aunts and uncles detested paying taxes almost as much as their father did, and it seemed the main purpose of All County was to siphon money from Trump management through large gifts disguised as legitimate business transactions, according to the article. The ruse was so effective that when Fred died in 1999, he had only $1.9 million in cash and no assets larger than a $10.3 million IOU from Donald. After Gam's death the following year, the combined value of my grandparents' estate was said to be just $51.8 million, a laughable assertion, especially since the siblings sold the empire for more than $700 million 4 years later. My grandfather's investment in Donald had been extremely successful in the short term. He had strategically deployed millions of dollars, and often tens of millions of dollars, at key moments in Donald's career. Sometimes the funds had supported the image and the lifestyle that came with it. Sometimes they had bought Donald access and favors. With increasing frequency, they had bailed him out. In that way, Fred purchased the ability to bask in Donald's reflected glory, satisfied with the knowledge that none of it would have been possible without his expertise and largesse. In the long run, however, my grandfather, who had one wish, that his empire survive in perpetuity, lost everything. Whenever my brother and I met with Robert to discuss my grandfather's estate, he was emphatic about honoring my grandfather's wish that we get nothing. When it came to their own benefit, however, the 4 surviving Trump siblings had no compunction about doing the one thing my grandfather least would have wanted. When Donald announced his desire to sell, nobody put up a fight. In 2004, the vast majority of the empire my grandfather had spent more than 7 decades building was sold to a single buyer, Ruby Schron, for $705.6 million. The banks financing the sale for Schron had assigned a value of almost $1 billion to the properties, so in one fell swoop, my Uncle Donald, the master dealmaker, left almost $300 million on the table. Selling the estate in bulk was a strategic disaster. The smartest thing would have been to keep Trump management intact. With practically no effort on their part, the 4 siblings could have earned $5 million to $10 million a year each. But Donald needed a much bigger infusion of cash. Such a paltry sum, even if it came to him annually, wasn't going to cut it. They could also have sold the buildings and complexes individually. That would have added substantially to the selling price. That process, though, would have been a lengthy one. Donald, whose Atlantic City creditors were nipping at his heels, didn't want to wait. Besides, it would have been almost impossible to keep the news of dozens of sales a secret. They needed to complete the sale in one transaction, as quickly and as quietly as possible. They succeeded on that score. It may be the only one of Donald's real estate deals that received no press attention. Whatever objections Marianne, Elizabeth, and Robert might have had, they kept to themselves. Even now, Marianne, almost 10 years older, smarter, and more accomplished than the second youngest Trump child, deferred to him. Donald always got his way, she said. Besides, none of them could risk waiting. They all knew where the bodies were buried, because they had buried them together in All County. Split 4 ways, they each got approximately $170 million. For Donald, it still wasn't enough. Maybe it wasn't for any of them. Nothing ever was. When I visited Marianne in September 2018, less than a month before the article was published, she mentioned that she had been contacted by David Barstow. My cousin David, who had tracked my grandfather's old accountant Jack Mitnick, now 91, to a nursing home somewhere in Florida, believed he must have been the source of the exposé. Marianne brushed the whole thing off and suggested that the article was merely about the 1990 codicil controversy. If she did speak to Barstow, though, she must have known the extent of what they were looking into, all county, the potential tax fraud, but she seemed unfazed by it. I wondered, now for completely different reasons, why she and Robert hadn't tried everything in their power to dissuade Donald from running for president. They couldn't possibly have thought that he, and by extension they, would continue to escape scrutiny. I met with Marianne again shortly after the article ran. She denied all of it. She was just a girl, after all. When a piece of paper requiring her signature had been put in front of her, she'd signed it, no questions asked. This article goes back 60 years. You know, that's before I was a judge, she said, as if the investigation had also ended 60 years before. She seemed unconcerned that there would be any repercussions. Although a court inquiry had been opened into her alleged conduct, all she had had to do to put an end to it was retire, which she did, thereby retaining her $200,000 a year pension. In the interim, she had transferred her suspicion from the geriatric Jack Mitnick to her first cousin John Walter, my grandfather's sister Elizabeth's son, who had died that January. I marveled at the ease with which Marianne jumped to that conclusion. John had worked for and with my grandfather for decades, had benefited enormously from his uncle's wealth, had been heavily involved in all county, and, as far as I knew, had always been very loyal. I thought it strange that she would implicate him, although her suspicions of him worked in my favor. What I didn't know at the time was that John's obituary had neglected to mention Donald. John had always been interested in Trump family history and boastful of his connection with Trump management, so that was a remarkable omission. More surprising, though, was the fact that Marianne didn't seem to think that I would find anything in the article disturbing, as if she, too, had come to believe a version of events that obliterated the truth and rewrote history. It didn't occur to her that the revelations would affect me in any way. In fact, the vast amounts of money the siblings had possibly stolen made their fight with us over my grandfather's will and their drastic devaluation of our partnership share, which I now understood for the first time, seem pathologically petty, and their treatment of my nephew, vis-à-vis our medical insurance, even more cruel. Chapter 14. A Civil Servant in Public Housing. There's a through line from the house to the Trump Tower triplex to the West Wing, just as there is from Trump management to the Trump Organization to the Oval Office. The first are essentially controlled environments in which Donald's material needs have always been taken care of. The second, a series of sinecures in which the work was done by others and Donald never needed to acquire expertise in order to attain or retain power, which partly explains his disdain for the expertise of others. All of this has protected Donald from his own failures while allowing him to believe himself a success. Donald was to my grandfather what the border wall has been for Donald, a vanity project funded at the expense of more worthy pursuits. Fred didn't groom Donald to succeed him. When he was in his right mind, he wouldn't trust Trump management to anybody. Instead, he used Donald, despite his failures and poor judgment, as the public face of his own thwarted ambition. Fred kept propping up Donald's false sense of accomplishment until the only asset Donald had was the ease with which he could be duped by more powerful men. There was a long line of people willing to take advantage of him. In the 1980s, New York journalists and gossip columnists discovered that Donald couldn't distinguish between mockery and flattery and used his shamelessness to sell papers. That image and the weakness of the man it represented were precisely what appealed to Mark Burnett. By 2004, when The Apprentice first aired, Donald's finances were a mess, even with his $170 million cut of my grandfather's estate when he and his siblings sold the properties, and his own empire consisted of increasingly desperate branding opportunities such as Trump Steaks, Trump Vodka, and Trump University. That made him an easy target for Burnett. Both Donald and the viewers were the butt of the joke that was The Apprentice, which, despite all evidence to the contrary, presented him as a legitimately successful tycoon. For the first 40 years of his real estate career, my grandfather never and 80s, however, debt. All of that changed as Donald's ambitions grew larger and his missteps became more frequent. Far from expanding his father's empire, everything Donald did after Trump Tower, which, along with his first project, the Grand Hyatt, could never have been accomplished without Fred's money and influence, chipped away at the empire's value. By the late 1980s, the Trump Organization seemed to be in the business of losing money, as Donald siphoned untold millions away from Trump management in order to support the growing myth of himself as a real estate phenom and master dealmaker. Ironically, as Donald's failures in real estate grew, so did my grandfather's need for him to appear successful. Fred surrounded Donald with people who knew what they were doing while giving him the credit, who propped him up and lied for him, who knew how the family business worked. The more money my grandfather threw at Donald, the more confidence Donald had, which led him to pursue bigger and riskier projects, which led to greater failures, forcing Fred to step in with more help. By continuing to enable Donald, my grandfather kept making him worse, more needy for media attention and free money, more self-aggrandizing and delusional about his greatness. Although bailing out Donald was originally Fred's exclusive domain, it didn't take long for the banks to become partners in the project. At first, taken in by what they believed to be Donald's ruthless efficiency and ability to get a job done, they were operating in good faith. As the bankruptcies piled up and the bills for the reckless purchases came due, the loans continued, but now as a means to maintain the illusion of success that had fooled them in the first place. It's understandable that Donald increasingly felt he had the upper hand, even if he didn't. He was completely unaware that other people were using him for their own ends and believed that he was in control. Fred, the banks, and the media gave him more leeway in order to get him to do their bidding. In the very early stages of his attempts to take over the Commodore Hotel, Donald held a press conference presenting his involvement in the project as a fait accompli. He lied about transactions that hadn't taken place, inserting himself in a way that made it difficult for him to be removed. He and Fred then used this gambit to leverage his newly inflated reputation in the New York press and many millions of dollars of my grandfather's money to get enormous tax abatements for his next development, Trump Tower. In Donald's mind, he has accomplished everything on his own merits, cheating notwithstanding. How many interviews has he given in which he offers the obvious falsehood that his father loaned him a mere $1 million that he had to pay back, but he was otherwise solely responsible for his success? It's easy to understand why he would believe this. Nobody has failed upward as consistently and spectacularly as the ostensible leader of the shrinking free world. Donald today is much as he was at 3 years old, incapable of growing, learning or evolving, unable to regulate his emotions, moderate his responses, or take in and synthesize information. Donald's need for affirmation is so great that he doesn't seem to notice that the largest group of his supporters are people he wouldn't condescend to be seen with outside of a rally. His deep-seated insecurities have created in him a black hole of need that constantly requires the light of compliments that disappears as soon as he's soaked it in. Nothing is ever enough. This is far beyond garden-variety narcissism. Donald is not simply weak. His ego is a fragile thing that must be bolstered every moment because he knows deep down that he is nothing of what he claims to be. He knows he has never been loved, so he must draw you in if he can by getting you to assent to even the most seemingly insignificant thing. Isn't this plane great? Yes, Donald, this plane is great. It would be rude to begrudge him that small concession. Then he makes his vulnerabilities and insecurities your responsibility. You must assuage them. You must take care of him. Failing to do so leaves a vacuum that is unbearable for him to withstand for long. If you're someone who cares about his approval, you'll say anything to retain it. He has suffered mightily, and if you aren't doing all you can to alleviate that suffering, you should suffer too. From his childhood in the house to his early forays into the New York real estate world and high society until today, Donald's aberrant behavior has been consistently normalized by others. When he hit the New York real estate scene, he was touted as a brash, self-made deal-maker. Brash was applied to him as a compliment, used to imply self-assertiveness more than rudeness or arrogance, and he was neither self-made nor a good deal-maker. But that was how it started, with his misuse of language and the media's failure to ask pointed questions. His real skills, self-aggrandizement, lying, and sleight of hand, were interpreted as strengths unique to his brand of success. By perpetuating his version of the story he wanted told about his wealth and his subsequent successes, our family, and then many others, started the process of normalizing Donald. His hiring and treatment of undocumented workers and his refusal to pay contractors for completed work were assumed to be the cost of doing business. Treating people with disrespect and nickel and diming them made him look tough. Those misrepresentations must have seemed harmless at the time, a way to sell more copies of the New York Post or increase the viewership of Inside Edition. But each transgression inevitably led to another, more serious one. The idea that his tactics were legitimate calculations instead of unethical cons was yet another aspect of the myth that he and my grandfather had been constructing for decades. Though Donald's fundamental nature hasn't changed, since his inauguration, the amount of stress he's under has changed dramatically. It's not the stress of the job, because he isn't doing the job, unless watching TV and tweeting insults count. It's the effort to keep the rest of us distracted from the fact that he knows nothing about politics, civics, or simple human decency that requires an enormous amount of work. For decades, he's gotten publicity, good and bad, but he's rarely been subjected to close scrutiny, and he's never had to face significant opposition. His entire sense of himself and the world is being questioned. Donald's problems are accumulating because the maneuvering required to solve them, or to pretend they don't exist, has become more complicated, requiring many more people to execute the cover-ups. Donald is completely unprepared to solve his own problems or adequately cover his tracks. After all, the systems were set up in the first place to protect him from his own weaknesses, not help him negotiate the wider world. The walls of his very expensive and well-guarded padded cell are starting to disintegrate. The people with access to him are weaker than Donald is, more craven, but just as desperate. Their futures are directly dependent on his success and favor. They either fail to see or refuse to believe that their fate will be the same as that of anyone who pledged loyalty to him in the past. There seems to be an endless number of people willing to join the claque that protects Donald from his own inadequacies while perpetuating his unfounded belief in himself. Although more powerful people put Donald into the institutions that have shielded him since the very beginning, it's people weaker than he is who are keeping him there. When Donald became a serious contender for the Republican Party nomination, and then the nominee, the national media treated his pathologies, his mendacity, his delusional grandiosity, as well as his racism and misogyny, as if they were entertaining idiosyncrasies beneath which lurked maturity and seriousness of purpose. Over time, the vast bulk of the Republican Party, from the extreme right to the so-called moderates, either embraced him or, in order to use his weakness and malleability to their own advantage, looked the other way. After the election, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Mitch McConnell, all of whom bear more than a passing psychological resemblance to Fred, recognized in a way others should have but did not, that Donald's checkered personal history and his unique personality flaws make him extremely vulnerable to manipulation by smarter, more powerful men. His pathologies have rendered him so simple-minded that it takes nothing more than repeating to him the things he says to and about himself dozens of times a day, he's the smartest, the greatest, the best, to get him to do whatever they want, whether it's imprisoning children in concentration camps, betraying allies, implementing economy-crushing tax cuts, or degrading every institution that's contributed to the United States' rise and the flourishing of liberal democracy. In an article for The Atlantic, Adam Serwer wrote that for Donald, the cruelty is the point. For Fred, that was entirely true. One of the few pleasures my grandfather had, aside from making money, was humiliating others. Convinced of his rightness in all situations, buoyed by his stunning success and belief in his superiority, he had to punish any challenge to his authority swiftly and decisively, and put the challenger in his place. That was effectively what happened when Fred promoted Donald over Freddie to be president of Trump management. Unlike my grandfather, Donald has always struggled for legitimacy as an adequate replacement for Freddie, as a Manhattan real estate developer or casino tycoon, and now as the occupant of the Oval Office, who can never escape the taint of being utterly without qualification or the sense that his win was illegitimate. Over Donald's lifetime, as his failures mounted despite my grandfather's repeated and extravagant interventions, his struggle for legitimacy, which could never be won, turned into a scheme to make sure nobody found out that he's never been legitimate at all. This has never been more true than it is now, and it is exactly the conundrum our country finds itself in. The government, as it is currently constituted, including the executive branch, half of Congress, and the majority of the Supreme Court, is entirely in the service of protecting Donald's ego. That has become almost its entire purpose. His cruelty serves, in part, as a means to distract both us and himself from the true extent of his failures. The more egregious his failures become, the more egregious his cruelty becomes. Who can pay attention to the children he's kidnapped and put into concentration camps on the Mexican border when he's threatening to out whistleblowers, coercing senators to acquit him in the face of overwhelming evidence of guilt, and pardoning Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, who'd been accused of war crimes and convicted of posing for a picture with a corpse, all within the same month? If he can keep 47,000 spinning plates in the air, nobody can focus on any one of them. So there's that. It's just a distraction. His cruelty is also an exercise of his power, such as it is. He has always wielded it against people who are weaker than he is, or who are constrained by their duty or dependence from fighting back. Employees and political appointees can't fight back when he attacks them in his Twitter feed, because to do so would risk their jobs or their reputations. Freddie couldn't retaliate when his little brother mocked his passion for flying because of his filial responsibility and his decency, just as governors in blue states, desperate to get adequate help for their citizens during the COVID-19 crisis, are constrained from calling out Donald's incompetence for fear he would withhold ventilators and other supplies needed in order to save lives. Donald learned a long time ago how to pick his targets. Donald continues to exist in the dark space between the fear of indifference and the fear of failure that led to his brother's destruction. It took 42 years for the destruction to be completed, but the foundations were laid early and played out before Donald's eyes as he was experiencing his own trauma. The combination of those two things, what he witnessed and what he experienced, both isolated him and terrified him. The role that fear played in his childhood and the role it plays now can't be overstated. And the fact that fear continues to be an overriding emotion for him speaks to the hell that must have existed inside the house 6 decades ago. Every time you hear Donald talking about how something is the greatest, the best, the biggest, the most tremendous, the implication being that he made them so, you have to remember that the man speaking is still, in essential ways, the same little boy who is desperately worried that he, like his older brother, is inadequate, and that he, too, will be destroyed for his inadequacy. At a very deep level, his bragging and false bravado are not directed at the audience in front of him, but at his audience of one, his long-dead father. Donald has always been able to get away with making blanket statements. I know more about fill in the blank than anybody, believe me. Or the other iteration, nobody knows more about fill in the blank than me. He's been allowed to riff about nuclear weapons, trade with China, and other things about which he knows nothing. He's gone essentially unchallenged when touting the efficacy of drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 that have not been tested, or engaging in an absurd revisionist history in which he's never made a mistake and nothing is his fault. It's easy to sound coherent and somewhat knowledgeable when you control the narrative and are never pressed to elaborate on your premise or demonstrate that you actually understand the underlying facts. It is an indictment, among many, of the media that none of that changed during the campaign, when exposing Donald's lies and outrageous claims might actually have saved us from his presidency. On the few occasions he was asked about his positions and policies, which for all intents and purposes don't really exist, he still wasn't expected or required to make sense or demonstrate any depth of understanding. Since the election, he's figured out how to avoid such questions completely. White House press briefings and formal news conferences have been replaced with chopper talk, during which he can pretend he can't hear any unwelcome questions over the noise of the helicopter blades. In 2020, his pandemic press briefings quickly devolved into mini campaign rallies filled with self-congratulation, demagoguery, and ring-kissing. In them, he has denied the unconscionable failures that have already killed thousands, lied about the progress that's being made, and scapegoated the very people who are risking their lives to save us despite being denied adequate protection and equipment by his administration. Even as hundreds of thousands of Americans are sick and dying, he spins it as a victory, as proof of his stunning leadership. And in the event that anybody thinks he's capable of being serious or somber, he'll throw in a joke about betting models or lie about the size of his Facebook following for good measure. Still, the news networks refuse to pull away. The few journalists who do challenge him, and even those who simply ask Donald for words of comfort for a terrified nation, are derided and dismissed as nasty. The through line from Donald's early destructive behavior that Fred actively encouraged to the media's unwillingness to challenge him and the Republican Party's willingness to turn a blind eye to the daily corruption he has committed since January 20th, 2017, have led to the impending collapse of this once great nation's economy, democracy, and health. We must dispense with the idea of Donald's strategic brilliance in understanding the intersection of media and politics. He doesn't have a strategy. He never has. Despite the fluke that was his electoral advantage and a victory that was at best suspect and at worst illegitimate, he never had his finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist. His bluster and shamelessness just happened to resonate with certain segments of the population. If what he was doing during the 2016 campaign hadn't worked, he would have kept doing it anyway, because lying, playing to the lowest common denominator, cheating, and sowing division are all he knows. He is incapable of adjusting to changing circumstances as he is of becoming presidential. He did tap into a certain bigotry and inchoate rage, which he's always been good at doing. The full-page screed he paid to publish in the New York Times in 1989, calling for the Central Park Five to be put to death, wasn't about his deep concern for the rule of law. It was an easy opportunity for him to take on a deeply serious topic that was very important to the city, while sounding like an authority in the influential and prestigious pages of the Gray Lady. It was unvarnished racism, meant to stir up racial animosity in a city already seething with it. All five boys, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCray, Raymond Santana, Corey Wise, and Yusef Salaam, were subsequently cleared, proven innocent via incontrovertible DNA evidence. To this day, however, Donald insists that they were guilty. Yet another example of his inability to drop a preferred narrative even when it's contradicted by established fact. Donald takes any rebuke as a challenge and doubles down on the behavior that drew fire in the first place, as if criticism is permission to do worse. Fred came to appreciate Donald's obstinacy because it signaled the kind of toughness he sought in his sons. 50 years later, people are literally dying because of his catastrophic decisions and disastrous inaction. With millions of lives at stake, he takes accusations about the federal government's failure to provide ventilators personally, threatening to withhold funding and life-saving equipment from states whose governors don't pay sufficient homage to him. That doesn't surprise me. The deafening silence in response to such a blatant display of sociopathic disregard for human life, or the consequences of one's actions, on the other hand, fills me with despair and reminds me that Donald isn't really the problem after all. This is the end result of Donald's having continually been given a pass and rewarded not just for his failures, but for his transgressions, against tradition, against decency, against the law, and against fellow human beings. His acquittal in the sham Senate impeachment trial was another such reward for bad behavior. The lies may become true in his mind as soon as he utters them, but they're still lies. It's just another way for him to see what he can get away with, and so far, he's gotten away with everything. Epilogue. The 10th Circle. On November 9th, 2016, my despair was triggered in part by the certainty that Donald's cruelty and incompetence would get people killed. My best guess at the time was that that would occur through a disaster of his own making, such as an avoidable war he either provoked or stumbled into. I couldn't have anticipated how many people would willingly enable his worst instincts, which have resulted in government-sanctioned kidnapping of children, detaining of refugees at the border, and betrayal of our allies, among other atrocities. And I couldn't have foreseen that a global pandemic would present itself, allowing him to display his grotesque indifference to the lives of other people. Donald's initial response to COVID-19 underscores his need to minimize negativity at all costs. Fear, the equivalent of weakness in our family, is as unacceptable to him now as it was when he was 3 years old. When Donald is in the most trouble, superlatives are no longer enough. Both the situation and his reactions to it must be unique, even if absurd or nonsensical. On his watch, no hurricane has ever been as wet as Hurricane Maria. Nobody could have predicted a pandemic that his own Department of Health and Human Services was running simulations for just a few months before COVID-19 struck in Washington state. Why does he do this? Fear. Donald didn't drag his feet in December 2019, in January, in February, in March, because of his narcissism. He did it because of his fear of appearing weak or failing to project the message that everything was great, beautiful, and perfect. The irony is that his failure to face the truth has inevitably led to massive failure anyway. In this case, the lives of potentially hundreds of thousands of people will be lost, and the economy of the richest country in history may well be destroyed. Donald will acknowledge none of this, moving the goalposts to hide the evidence and convincing himself in the process that he's done a better job than anybody else could have if only a few 100,000 people die instead of 2 million. Get even with people who have screwed you, Donald has said, but often the person he's getting revenge on is somebody he's screwed over first, such as the contractors he's refused to pay or the niece and nephew he refused to protect. Even when he manages to hit his target, his aim is so bad that he causes collateral damage. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, and currently the de facto leader of the country's COVID-19 response, has committed not only the sin of insufficiently kissing Donald's ass, but the ultimate sin of showing Donald up by being better and more competent, a real leader who is respected and effective and admired. Donald can't fight back by shutting Cuomo up or reversing his decisions. Having abdicated his authority to lead a nationwide response, he no longer has the ability to counter decisions made at the state level. Donald can insult Cuomo and complain about him, but every day, the governor's real leadership further reveals Donald as a petty, pathetic little man, ignorant, incapable, out of his depth, and lost in his own delusional spin. What Donald can do in order to offset the powerlessness and rage he feels is punish the rest of us. He'll withhold ventilators or steal supplies from states that have not groveled sufficiently. If New York continues not to have enough equipment, Cuomo will look bad, the rest of us be damned. Thankfully, Donald doesn't have many supporters in New York City, but even some of those will die because of his craven need for revenge. What Donald thinks is justified retaliation is, in this context, mass murder. It would have been easy for Donald to be a hero. People who have hated and criticized him would have forgiven or overlooked his endless stream of appalling actions if he'd simply had somebody take the pandemic preparedness manual down from the shelf where it was put after the Obama administration gave it to him. If he'd alerted the appropriate agencies and state governments at first evidence the virus was highly contagious, had extremely high mortality rates, and was not being contained. If he'd invoked the Defense Production Act of 1950 to begin production of PPE, ventilators, and other necessary equipment to prepare the country to deal with the worst-case scenario. If he'd allowed medical and scientific experts to give daily press conferences during which facts were presented clearly and honestly, if he'd ensured that there was a systematic, top-down approach and coordination among all of the necessary agencies, most of those tasks would have required almost no effort on his part. All he would have had to do was make a couple of phone calls, give a speech or two, then delegate everything else. He might have been accused of being too cautious, but most of us would have been safe, and many more of us would have survived. Instead, states are forced to buy vital supplies from private contractors. The federal government commandeers those supplies, and then FEMA distributes them back to private contractors, who then resell them. While thousands of Americans die alone, Donald touts stock market gains. As my father lay dying alone, Donald went to the movies. If he can, in any way, profit from your death, he'll facilitate it, and then he'll ignore the fact that you died. Why did it take so long for Donald to act? Why didn't he take the novel coronavirus seriously? In part because, like my grandfather, he has no imagination. The pandemic didn't immediately have to do with him, and managing the crisis in every moment doesn't help him promote his preferred narrative that no one has ever done a better job than he has. As the pandemic moved into its third, then fourth month, and the death toll continued its rise into the tens of thousands, the press started to comment on Donald's lack of empathy for those who have died and the families they leave behind. The simple fact is that Donald is fundamentally incapable of acknowledging the suffering of others. Telling the stories of those we've lost would bore him. Acknowledging the victims of COVID-19 would be to associate himself with their weakness, a trait his father taught him to despise. Donald can no more advocate for the sick and dying than he could put himself between his father and Freddie. Perhaps most crucially, for Donald there is no value in empathy, no tangible upside to caring for other people. David Korn wrote, "Everything is transactional for this poor, broken human being. Everything. It is an epic tragedy of parental failure that my uncle does not understand that he, or anybody else, has intrinsic worth." In Donald's mind, even acknowledging an inevitable threat would indicate weakness. Taking responsibility would open him up to blame. Being a hero, being good, is impossible for him. The same could be said of his handling of the worst civil unrest since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This is another crisis in which it would have been so easy for Donald to triumph, but his ignorance overwhelms his ability to turn to his advantage the third national catastrophe to occur on his watch. An effective response would have entailed a call for unity, but Donald requires division. It is the only way he ensured that decades ago when he turned his children against each other. I can only imagine the envy with which Donald watched Derek Chauvin's casual cruelty and monstrous indifference as he murdered George Floyd, hands in his pockets, his insouciant gaze aimed at the camera. I can only imagine that Donald wishes it had been his knee on Floyd's neck. Instead, Donald withdraws to his comfort zones, Twitter, Fox News, casting blame from afar, protected by a figurative or literal bunker. He rants about the weakness of others even as he demonstrates his own. But he can never escape the fact that he is, and always will be, a terrified little boy. Donald's monstrosity is the manifestation of the very weakness within him that he's been running from his entire life. For him, there has never been any option but to be positive, to project strength, no matter how illusory, because doing anything else carries a death sentence. My father's short life is evidence of that. The country is now suffering from the same toxic positivity that my grandfather deployed specifically to drown out his ailing wife, torment his dying son, and damage past healing the psyche of his favorite child, Donald J. Trump. Everything's great. Right, Toots? Acknowledgements. It's Simon & Schuster, thanks to John Karp, Eamon Dolan, Jessica Chin, Paul DiPolito, Lynn Anderson, and Jackie Sau. At WME, thanks to Jay Mandel and Shan Ashley Edwards. Thank you also to Carolyn Levin for your thoughtful vetting, David Korn at Mother Jones for your kindness, Darren Ankrum, fact-checker extraordinaire, Stuart Olchik for telling me about better days, Captain Jerry Lawler for all of the wonderful TWA history, and Marianne Trump-Barry for all of the enlightening information. My appreciation to Denise Kemp for the solidarity with me, to my mother, Linda Trump, for all of the great stories, Laura Schweers, Debbie R., Stephanie B., and Jennifer T. for your friendship and trust when I most needed them, Jill and Mark Nass for helping us keep the tradition alive, JCE. To our beloved Trumpy, whom I miss every day. I am deeply grateful to Ted Boutros for that first meeting and for believing in the cause, Annie Champion for your generosity and friendship, Pat Roth for your thoughtful feedback and for being in my life, Anna Maria Forcier for being such a good friend to my dad. I am so glad I found you. Suzanne Craig and Russ Butner for their extraordinary journalism and integrity. Thank you for bringing me along for the ride. Sue, none of this would have been possible without your persistence, courage, and encouragement. Liz Stein for being on the journey with me and making this a better book, and this a much more fun, less lonely experience than it might have been, and of course for Baby Yoda. Eric Adler for being there for me throughout, for your tireless feedback, and for having my back at the local pawnbroker. And Alice Frankston for being involved from the very beginning of this project, believing in it even when I didn't, and reading every word more times than I can count. I can't wait for what comes next. And finally, to my daughter, Avery, for being more patient and understanding than any kid should have to be. I love you.
Too much and never enough. How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man was written and read by Mary L. Trump. It was recorded by Charles de Montebello and Kathleen Conti at CDM Sound Studios in New York City. Editing by Christina Pachano. Post-production by Hudson Sound. The associate producer was Claire Tadakoro. Too Much and Never Enough was produced and directed by Karen Perlman. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. Too Much and Never Enough. How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man is available in print from Simon & Schuster.